I'll unmute and you basically, so don't worry about that. So.
Okay, cool, perfect. Thank you. Like, no, yeah, it won't be working. I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, yeah, they'll say. It's dying. Yeah.
Ready during the middle of the thing and then straight away.
Should be all good. Yeah, so I'll be here. I'll stand up. Go and get the It's going to move the table. That's all right. I guess I'll do this one as well. Maybe fill the water up in the dressing room. One.
Super. Very warm welcome to you and to our very special guests this evening. And a warm welcome to everyone who's online and watching from wherever you're watching around the world. So you're all very, very welcome. My name's Professor Steve West. I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University and opening this very, very important BDAS lecture celebrating LGBT History Month 2026. I know that our speakers are going to intrigue us, are going to challenge us, and I hope you'll have an opportunity at some point also to ask some questions. So start jotting those down as we go through. We are University of the West of England. We hold a number of BDAS events throughout the year. You're very welcome to attend any that excite you and hopefully delight you, either in the city or on our campuses. We sort of move them around to make sure that we get the right audiences. Can I just encourage you, if you've got mobile phones, can I encourage you to, if you're in the audience, switch them off or put them on to silent so that it doesn't interfere with our speakers. We're not expecting any fire alarms this evening, so if the fire alarm does go off, then we will be supported by beacon staff who will be wearing blue tops, and they will make sure that we get out of the building safely. Please follow them and don't wander off and try and ski off piste and find your own way. It's better to stick together. The event is held within our code of conduct. Just a few words about our code of conduct. So it's a brief reminder, really, that today's event is supported by UWE's Code of Conduct. This is for staff and students. It's there to ensure that the discussions can take place in an open, respectful and lawful way, even where views may differ, experiences may differ. We welcome a wide range of contributions and perspectives, and we encourage thoughtful and enlightening questions. If at any point the question or contribution moves away from those expectations, the event host, or myself, will try and gently pull us back into line to make sure that we can keep the discussion going. I'm sure that will not happen this evening. And event staff are also available if anyone needs support during the session, and they're towards the back and on the side there. So in a moment we're going into the main event, which will last about an hour, and then audience Q&As will follow. And then at the end we'll close the event with some networking at the back of the hall, and you're all very welcome again to join us. So my job now is to introduce our speakers and give you a little bit of a bio about them. Our host tonight is Louise, just wave a little bit, Ndibwirende, and she is going to allow the difficult questions to be asked. She is our host, and I'm joined also. Is it on? Oh. I was fooled by the one that was there, which clearly isn't on. We're also joined by Louise, who's a TEDx and keynote speaker, aspiring... Oh, sorry, Antonia. Sorry. Antonia, who is... I'll start again. Antonia Forster, who is she, her pronoun, and is an award-winning speaker in the green room. She was sharing some of her insights. A creative technologist and a senior software engineer using VR, AR, and robotics for digital activism. Originally an animal behavior researcher, Antonia's TEDx talk on queerness in nature marked a turning point in her career, from science into tech. After teaching herself to code, well done, Antonia now combines research, storytelling, and engineering to deliver wide-reaching social impact projects. Her inaugural work, the LGBTQ VR Museum, was awarded the Tribeca Film Festival New Voices Award. Antonia has partnered with Meta, Deloitte, Qualcomm, and more to create XR projects that sit at the intersection of emerging technology and, importantly, social justice. She's joined, as one of our panellists, by Daryn Carter, pronouns he, him, has worked in equality and diversity for nearly 20 years and is very well known in Bristol. The founder of Bristol Pride, delivering the first modern Pride festival in Bristol in 2010. And he's grown and developed Bristol Pride to become one of the largest Pride events in the UK and one of Bristol's biggest annual events, with 40,000 people attending Pride Day and 25,000 people marching in the parade through the city. And it is a fantastic, spectacular occasion. Daryn's passion for diversity and inclusion started from a young age, was kick-started while working in recruitment at the BBC, where he supported underrepresented groups to access jobs and implemented inclusive recruitment processes within the organisation. Daryn has worked tirelessly to create a safe space for LGBT plus community, to be an advocate and raise the voice of the community, and to tackle inequality and social injustice. Importantly, in 2020, this was recognised and he received an MBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours and has been awarded the Freedom of the City of Bristol. And last but not least, was awarded, I have to say that, was awarded a Doctorate in Business Administration honoris causa from the University of the West of England in recognition of his services to the LGBT plus community in Bristol. And we were delighted when you accepted it. Thank you, Daryn. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to, importantly, the host, the referee for this evening, Louise, and she is going to help navigate through the questions and also invite you later to also ask some questions and hopefully get the answers from our panel. You're all very, very welcome. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. How is everyone feeling? I genuinely really appreciate when people physically show up to events around these kind of conversations, because it's just so important. And I think there's something really special about being able to connect with each other, to be able to hear from speakers. So for me, it's like an extra special privilege to be able to be the host. I'm Louise, I'm pronounced she, her. I'm a UE graduate of 2011. Which feels like a very long time ago. But I have held so much love for the university and the wider Bristol community. I'm a fellow gay, and I'm still very gay. But I'm like, so it's very like a personal thing for me to be able to host this. And I hope that you are gonna really enjoy the conversations that we're gonna be having together. So to start off, tonight is very much with the conversation and themes around evolution and activism, which I think is very interesting in terms of that kind of combination of really understanding the historical and then the present day. And, you know, activism is something, for me, is very much an active word, an action word, a verb of what we do. And I really hope that this next hour is going to hopefully give you loads of really interesting insights into how that looks like. So we're going to be exploring together in terms of how queer identities and histories and communities are understood, are represented and supported across science, technology and society. And we'll reflect on how knowledge evolves, how activism creates change, and how representation shapes belonging. Obviously, this month is LGBT History Month, which comes around every year, but also sometimes takes people by surprise at the same time. And I think this really gives us a very exciting opportunity to really kind of celebrate the progress that we have achieved, but also to recognize there's very much still work to do. I mean, I think even if you easily switch on the news, it's so in your face about the work that there is still to do. But I think it's so important to not get lost in kind of what may feel like a vortex of despair. And so I think being able to sit and to discuss the challenges and the wins and the growth is so important. And so this evening's really going to bring together voices at the intersection of science, digital innovation, and community activism, and hopefully we're able to go a bit deeper in terms of those conversations, what that looks like and feels like. And obviously you guys will have an opportunity to ask any questions. So if there's anything that comes up during the panelist talks, please do save them, because I think that is when you get really the meatiness of engagement and conversation. I think we're actually very fortunate to be joined with our two speakers, especially as alumni of the university, and for us all to be alumni, I think is really special to kind of what individuals can go on to do, and also to be able to come back to kind of where it all started at the same time. So I'm going to go on in terms of going. Did everyone feel that at the same time? Okay. I'm going to go on to my first question. And so I'd really love to know from the both of you in terms of what led you both into your current roles, and how did queerness shape your career paths?
Yeah, I'll take that. So I have to admit, I'm actually an alumni of University of Bristol. I'm sorry, but I am a
sorry. The door's over there. I'm joking.
but I am a Bristol alumni. Yeah, so queerness for me was extremely impactful on my journey and my career. So for a bit of context, I grew up in quite a homophobic household. I knew from a young age that I was queer. I didn't necessarily have the language for it, but I kind of knew that I liked people of different genders, and that it didn't kind of, I would describe myself as either bi or pan, that I'm attracted to people of all genders. But that wasn't something that I could disclose. It was very clear to me as a child that I could not disclose that information safely, even physically safely. So I stayed in the closet my whole childhood, teen years, and most of my kind of young adult life. And then I started sort of coming out quietly to friends and to kind of other people in my life, but never to my family. And I even started going to science festivals. At the time, I was a science communicator, so I was working in zoos and science centres. I actually worked in Bristol Planetarium. I also worked in Bristol Zoo, so I've been in a lot of institutions in the city. My degree is originally in zoology and animal behaviour, and I just found it really interesting. So I actually left research to go into communication, because I was publishing these papers, but no one was really reading them, or if they were, it was a particular kind of sector of people. And I just thought this information is so interesting and kind of funny and entertaining, and I just want to take this to the people. So I started making comedy sets about biology and animal behavior. I started writing songs and raps and kind of taking the information to the people. And while I was doing that, I kind of heard this narrative that being queer is not natural. And I thought, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Because first of all, you know, what do we mean by natural? Things that are natural are not necessarily good or bad. There's no moral reflection in the animal kingdom. But also, it is something we see in nature all the time. So because I kept hearing it, I got fed up of it, and I wrote a talk about it. I did a kind of a set. And I started kind of touring that at different science festivals, and eventually I was invited to speak at TEDx Bristol. Now, TEDx Bristol at the time was the biggest TEDx event in Europe. It was actually right here, previously called Colston Hall, to 2,000 people, so it was an enormous event. But I knew with an event that size, my family would become aware of it. And I wanted to be clear during that talk that I was part of the queer community, and that's why I sort of had a stake in this conversation, as well as having scientific, professional experience and understanding about queerness in nature. So I had a very difficult decision to make about, do I come out to my family and go ahead with this talk, or do I decline it, you know, and this incredible opportunity? And it was sure to be life-changing either way. So in the end, I decided that I would come out, and I did do that quietly to my family a few months before the talk was scheduled to happen. And it was extremely negative. My family did not respond well at all. Some members of my family came around later, many of them didn't, and I had to cut contact with them completely. And that resulted in quite a difficult situation for me, both familial and emotionally, but also financially, because science communication is very poorly enumerated, and I wasn't really earning enough to support myself, and certainly not to buy a house or kind of achieve financial goals. So I decided I would go ahead with it, but if I did that, I had to forge a different path for myself in terms of my career. So I decided I'd become a software engineer. I was really interested in technology anyway. I've always loved video games. I was working in the planetarium, so I had access to this 360 3D environment. So I decided to learn a program called Unity and a language called C#. I used YouTube. I didn't really have any money to kind of educate myself with, so I just used free online tutorials. Within about 6 months, I actually learned enough to get a development job as a software engineer. And a year later, I actually started working at Unity, who make the software that I had taught myself. And I worked there for 4 years before leaving about a year and a half ago to work in an education facility making VR. So I really credit my kind of career as a software engineer to being queer. Because if I hadn't come out, I wouldn't have made that kind of U-turn into technology very deliberately. And I'm very glad I did. In fact, I think that U-turn is probably the best thing I ever did for my well-being. But because of that, I'm very focused on using my technical skills to give back to the queer community, because my identity is so tied with being both queer and a software engineer. Sorry, long answer. But
A long answer, but a beautiful one. So, Daryn, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's so great to kind of hear your story, but I think, you know, it is a story that is shared by so many people within the queer community. And me personally, you know, very similar situation, like actually, you know, a very bad home life when I was younger, and I actually left home, ran away at 16 to get away from a violent situation at home. And, you know, I was sleeping in school initially until they found out that I was sleeping at school, and then thankfully a friend took me in, and I kind of was able to kind of get myself up to London, really, and that's kind of, yeah, kind of my very young experience. But I kind of grew up in quite a rural, isolated area at a time when there was not, I think we just about had internet, to age myself a little bit, but like the internet was just still a very new thing and kind of controlled by your parents because you had to use the dial-up and there was one computer in the house kind of thing. So, you know, it was really hard to kind of access kind of information about, you know, being queer and kind of finding your identity as a young person. So that was really challenging, but I just knew that, like, same thing, like I'm different, something's not quite right. So yeah, that kind of, from a very young age, kind of shaped my, wow, had to grow up pretty hard. And, you know, same thing, like, you know, not having that financial support, like just having to start working straight away. And, you know, one of my funniest anecdotes is like, talk about my career. You know, I was like, if anyone knows Leicester Square, they have a little Haagen-Dazs place on the corner. And I was in London, I was like, I'll just get a little job here just to earn a bit of money. And I did a job there and was like, oh, and then they worked out I was under 18 and I couldn't work there because I wasn't old enough to use the blenders because they, you know, they're sharp and can't be trusted with those. And then I tried to get a job at a restaurant, but I wasn't old enough to serve alcohol. It was really challenging. So yeah, it was quite hard, but say grow up pretty fast. But I went to university in London. I was already there, and having like left home, I didn't want to kind of uproot myself very much. So I managed to just get through university. You know, thank God we still had like grants and bursaries back then in those days to kind of be able to financially put myself through university. So I mean, my degree is in biochemistry, so technically I'm a scientist, but I'm not. But actually what happened is while I was working at, while I was at university, I started working and temping at the BBC. Originally in Radio 5 Live doing stenography work, like just like inputting lots of information about footballers and stuff into a system so that when CFAX and subtitles you know, were working, they could pull up this information. So that's why my brain is full of lots of early noughties football knowledge. Great for those pub quizzes, but not for anything modern. But I would take myself down the corridor of television studios every lunchtime and after work and before work and go and work at Blue Peter and just like literally just give myself my time for free to help and work there, and eventually they gave me a job. So I did a lot of work in children's television when I was younger and at university, and then when I finished I carried on working there. And actually you think like television is like, oh, you know, the BBC and stuff is probably a very queer and friendly space, and to be, you know, television must be full of queer people, but actually it felt really challenging. Definitely felt like I still couldn't be myself. Definitely still heard a lot of homophobic language. So yeah, it kind of, you know, made me kind of put myself back in the closet at work and kind of had to hide who I was through there. And then eventually the roles that I was doing led me into recruitment somehow, and I ended up doing recruitment for the BBC. And I was just like, you know what, things need to change. Like, you know, these attitudes need to change. Like, as a young person, my queerness, I guess, made me more attuned to the fact that, like, diversity makes things better. And, like, seeing jobs and opportunities that maybe you feel like are not for you could be for you. And I think that's what initially drove me to kind of land into doing a bit of diversity work and what the universities and stuff now call widening participation. But, like, you know, doing that outreach work and kind of saying, actually, you know, this job in IT, for example, isn't just for, you know, males, you know, it's open to everyone. And so thinking about, like, how we kind of advertise things, who we were reaching, who we were talking to, but on the back of that needed to maybe change some attitudes and mindsets within the industry as well. So doing a bit of, like, you know, recruitment work and fair selection training and things like that to make sure that when these people are applying, they are getting the opportunities, they're getting the interviews, they're being asked the right questions, and everyone's being asked the same questions rather than walls and barriers that are kind of stopping people. So I think really that was my first kind of foray into diversity and equality work. And then my partner at the time got a job down in Bristol. I'd never heard of Bristol. And I moved, you know, they've got a BBC in Bristol, great. So I moved down to the BBC here, and then still working in recruitment, and again, carried on doing the work really, just to using, I guess, shaping my experiences and saying, actually, I want everyone to have equal opportunity. I want everyone to have a fair shot. We may need to change some things to make sure that happens, but mostly it's about telling people you can have that fair shot. So I think really for me, my queerness has just been passion. You know, shaped by my experiences, yes, and the experience I hear from other people, but also just a passion to make society a fairer and better place for everyone. So that's kind of been my drive all the time. And it was in about, well, it was, 2009, there was like, a bit of a call out really to be like, you know, there isn't a Pride event in Bristol. I think we were the 8th largest city in the country at the time. There hadn't been a Pride since the early 90s. You know, is anyone interested in getting, you know, coming together and make one happen? And I was like, I was actually kind of pushed to be like, oh, you'd be good at that, you know, go along, you know. And selfishly, again, also about wanting to make a better place and change happen, you know. I still remember experiencing homophobia in Bristol and thinking, do you know what, if we had a Pride, perhaps we could use that as a voice to kind of challenge that hate and prejudice and use a platform really to uplift the community. And so, yeah, I just went along to this meeting, and before I knew it, I was one of the founding directors for the festival. And you know, with no background in events experience or anything like that. So it was kind of a bit strange, but, you know, with a lot of tenacity and a lot of passion to make it happen. And, you know, this is my 17th year now doing Pride, so, you know, hopefully I'm doing something right. And it's, you know, been able to grow to be one of the biggest Pride events in the country. But still remembering, like, I guess the important thing I should have said actually, is what Pride means to me and how that has shaped my life. So being in that small rural town and kind of being very isolated and alone, like, it was a real dark time for me. And actually some friends that I had made in London were like, come on, we're going to take you to a Pride event. And they took me to Brighton Pride. And at the time it was still free to attend. So again, that's something that's really important to me, no financial barriers to be able to access an event that, you know, is that important. And it was just life-changing. You know, from, like, to suddenly get to an event where there were thousands of people like me there, and that I wasn't a freak, I wasn't alone. I was able to see myself reflected in other people and also just bathe in the celebration and joy. It was life-changing, and honestly, I do think it saved my life. So I hold that really closely with me now, and you kind of say, like, how have our queer experiences shaped where we are now? Absolutely, that's something that's, yeah, kind of made me do what I want to do now.
I'm sure that the audience would agree that that is so, both of your answers were so powerful in terms of, like, both that understanding that your queerness is so intrinsic to who you are, in terms of the foundation of who you are and what has built you in terms of today. And that also, that journey has come with quite a few challenges of kind of getting to know yourself and what does that mean for you, and also how does that mean how you show up for others and also how you serve others. I feel like for both of you has been quite strong, and which I think is quite nice, because even for myself, my career started because of my LGBT society and getting involved. And that's how I then built my career in now being an EDI consultant. And so I think it's, so be more gay, guys. That's the moral of today's story. But no, but like, it's just kind of, it's beautiful to see just how actually that kind of authenticity of trueness to yourself about what that can lead in the future. So I'd really love to now kind of like go into the kind of like the themes of today's conversation in terms of science and history and how it's shaped kind of LGBT identities. And so the first question I'd love to go into is that, so from giraffes to bugs and grasses to fungi, queerness can be found everywhere. Yet is often thought as not natural, and I'm putting that in quotes because we all know that's not true. How have you found science to challenge this idea?
Yeah, so as I said, like I kept hearing, especially when I was actively working in scientific research, I kept hearing this idea that, you know, being queer is, quote, not natural. And I think quite often, surprisingly often, people will turn to science and cherry pick certain ideas deliberately to try and justify beliefs, whether they're pro-social or whether they're anti-social. And I find it particularly egregious when people try to use science to justify bigotry, because first of all, that's not what science is or is about. Cherry picking is kind of innately unscientific. The scientific approach is based on reason and evidence. So there are things like meta-analyses where you look at everything and kind of see what's been published. And I think the scientific method is kind of the best method we have of understanding the world around us. But trying to use it to justify sort of moral decision-making or to force your morals or your decisions, especially about your own life, on someone else is just not a valid approach. It's not a thing that you should do. And then in particular, it's just egregious because being queer is extremely natural. The natural world doesn't really fit itself into boxes in the way we think of things like gender or sex. So, for example, in human society, we conflate gender and sex, and they're two entirely different things. Gender is really a human kind of psychosocial construct that doesn't really necessarily exist in the kind of animal or other organism kingdom. But sex or biological sex is something that exists, but it's not a binary. It's a sort of constellation of a lot of different factors. That's also true in humans. So sometimes in primary school, we learn that sex is based on genes, X and Y genes, your sex chromosomes. But that's not the full story. If you take biology any further than that, then you learn that sex is chromosomal to one degree. That affects your hormonal development, that affects your gonadal development, and that affects your phenotypic development. So whether you have, for example, breasts or a beard could be your phenotype. And at every part of this development, there's a whole spectrum of different traits. So X and Y are sort of not the only, XX and XY are not the only chromosomal variations in humans. You can be triple X or XXY or XYY. You can have XX or XY genes, but have different hormonal development that is not kind of stereotypical. You can have intersex development, intersex gonadal development. It's very hard for us to quantify how often that happens because often there's non-consensual surgery performed on babies to kind of erase intersex genitalia because of our kind of social beliefs. And then, of course, there's a whole spectrum of different phenotypic development, so hair levels or placement. So there's a real constellation of traits across all of these. And I think taking a label, labels can be useful because they convey a lot of information with very few words. But taking a label and expecting that to reflect the complexity of reality is very misjudged. So I think that trying to look in the animal kingdom for this kind of binary is misplaced, and you'll quickly find that it's inaccurate. When you look at things like other organisms, there's an organism called Tetrahymena thermophylla that has 7 different sexes. There's a fungus called Schizophilum commune that has 28,000 different sexes. So just the idea there only being 2 sexes is, first of all, kind of out the window. There's the desert grassland whiptail lizard, which actually only has one sex. There are only females ever at any one time. But you know, I won't do my whole TEDx talk right now. If you want to see a load of examples, I do an entire talk on this. But yeah, we see all kinds of different sexual expression, different morphology in animals, different behaviors. And so I think if you do look to science, you quickly see that there's a huge range of diversity, both in morphology and in behavior. And I think anyone trying to use biology to justify bigotry is very misplaced in doing so.
Mm. I'd love to extend that conversation to Daryn, if that's okay. To kind of like explore in terms of how we lean on history to not only tell us about the past, but also shape the future. How have you found in terms of how has queer history erased or rewritten in terms of what how society is told today?
Yeah, I think, it happens all the time, and it's been happening for a long time. And I think, so from scientific papers to, national trust estates and things like that, we've seen that LGBT plus history and people have often been erased. And I think it's kind of stems from a little bit of, it's kind of rewriting history a bit, isn't it, to make it kind of more palatable or to also adjust to society's I guess, pressures, that, we've talked about the difficulties of our families. Like, there are some of the estates and the histories of queer elders have been erased because the families have decided to erase that through shame, or just by wanting to kind of say, they weren't lovers, they were just friends that lived together. And that's something that we see very often. And I think also, we can look at it and say maybe it was language. Language has evolved massively, so we can also kind of say, well, actually, you'd look at them now and describe them as a gay couple, or that person was trans, but maybe the language didn't exist back then in those days, or it was just normal. We're looking at like the bigotry and the hate that we're seeing now and thinking this is something new, but trans people have existed for thousands of years, and like our communities existed for such a long time that it isn't new, but maybe the bigotry and the hatred that we are seeing is new. So yeah, sometimes you just look back and think, well, yeah, they were just people that lived together, without it needing to be described because it was just normal. Whereas now you kind of look back and it's like, well, they were a gay couple. And yeah, I say sometimes that's been erased, and I think we were kind of talking about like that the scientific method of like thinking that things are unnatural or something that can be kind of cured, I guess. But yeah, I think it's mostly because of oppression, and maybe that's also led to things not being studied, not being understood. It's only, science is great, and as you say, the scientific methods are the right way to do things, but you kind of look at some of the things that have happened in history, so like the AIDS pandemic, for example. I wonder if it wasn't just classified as a gay disease at the time, whether actually we'd be closer to a cure than we are nowadays, because it would have been dealt with a lot quicker, rather than just being going, oh, it's just a gay man's disease, so we can ignore it. So I think, yeah, some things like that have kind of changed society, and some, as I say, like people have used science in ways that it's not really meant to be, and perhaps using science as a way to gatekeep, like the treatment of our community, the same way, like perhaps the trans community's access to healthcare is being gatekeeped at the moment. So it's really interesting to kind of look at our history, and that oppression and erasure. And to kind of like look at where we are now with things, and yeah, for me personally, my final bit would be to say, like, I grew under like Section 28 at school, which was like the banning of talking of anything homosexual, which kind of meant that I couldn't talk about being queer to anyone, because the schools wouldn't talk about it. So I've been bullied, but I couldn't really talk about why I was being bullied, and I remember like one of my teachers being like, oh, hoping you're being I hope it isn't because you're gay, because, I just couldn't deal with that, and it's just like, well, okay, I'm not gonna talk to you about it now. So yeah, I think there's some things that can happen. That erasure and that oppression can be really harmful, and it's held back where society is today.
If I can jump in on the point actually about sort of erasure as well. So, as a trained scientist, like I obviously do believe in the value of the scientific method, but I think as well as deliberate erasure and oppression, which obviously does happen, I think science itself suffers from certain biases inherently that aren't always well understood by the public. So for example, question selection bias, which means what we expect to see informs the questions we ask and therefore the results we find. So for example, in society, we put a lot of onus on the difference between men and women. And so there are a lot of studies on the difference in different skills or approaches between men and women. But not very many people ask the question about the difference between blue-eyed people and brown-eyed people, or brunettes and blondes. And so because we ask one question many, many times, we're more likely to find a certain range of answers. So that's question selection bias. And then there's publication bias. So if you search for an answer and actually there's no difference, it's not that interesting. It's sometimes called the file draw problem. You're less likely to have your research published if it's not considered an interesting and valid contribution to science. So no difference, well, it doesn't get published. So then if you run a meta-analysis of the differences, you'll find more differences than not, because that's more interesting. There's sampling bias in terms of who is studied. So of course, white men are very well represented, and particularly university students are very well represented, because if you're working at a university, you just reach out to the people around you. So it turns out university students extremely well studied compared to anyone else, especially in the Western world. There's measurement bias, so things that are hard to quantify are hard to study, so they just don't get published either. So these things aren't necessarily deliberate erasure by scientists, but they're just innate to the scientific method itself. And that's why you can't necessarily just look at data and say, well, the data is always true. Yes, but of course it does go through its own. Slightly on that topic as well, there's something called stereotype threat. This is slightly tangential, but often I work in technology, and people are very focused on data and results. And so we might do something like, you mentioned recruitment, you might do something like give a test to a certain number of people and say, okay, whoever performs best gets the job, that's entirely fair. But there's something called stereotype threat, which is where if you feel that you're conforming to a negative stereotype about your group, you will perform worse on a quantified test. So if you put a single girl in a room full of boys and give her a maths test, she will perform worse than if she's in a room with an equal gender balance. And so you can easily see how that would impact someone who isn't represented in an interview. And that's why looking at results themselves without understanding of the context in which they're asked is not necessarily a fair way to approach things. So science, I think, can be overly focused sometimes on the quantifiable and not necessarily aware of its own limitations. Or if the scientists are aware, people reading the paper may not be aware of those limitations. So that is something to bear in mind as well.
You've both touched upon a little bit in terms of the preservation of stories and the importance of that. And so I'd love to kind of hear from you in terms of how do you feel technology can help preserve those stories, but also on the flip side of that, how do you feel it can also cause harm? Both if you look on today's digital world and then also beyond.
I think from my point of view, it's been really interesting. Actually, literally just last week, I dropped into an older LGBT plus cafe meeting arranged by Age UK, and kind of listening and hearing stories from the older generation. And every day is a school day. There's always something to learn, and older people can teach us so much. But actually, those stories haven't been gathered, and I think that's where, the technology that we have nowadays is changing a lot, and I think that's really important. Just to capture those stories and have them preserved, and look at the, we've got Out Stories in the room over here, and they've done a load of work at kind of archiving and collecting materials so that it's available online to look at and gather and do talks and things like that. But yeah, I think it's about preserving that history, and it hasn't been preserved, or it's been preserved through a lens of someone who wants to erase something that they find distasteful. So actually being able to use technology to kind of actually capture moments and record our actual history and our voices is so important, and it's a way to connect communities and bring people together, to bridge that age gap and divide, really, to kind of share those messages and stories. So I'm really looking forward to working on a project actually for that. So obviously in Bristol, those that may know, the very first Pride event, which we would look back and say is a Pride event, happened in 1977. So obviously that's a big anniversary coming up next year. So I'd really love to kind of use Pride as an opportunity to gather those stories and those messages, and technology is the way to do that, to kind of build those together. But yeah, I think, you know, it is something I'm sure we're going to be talking about, but like nowadays it's getting harder and harder to kind of verify the, you know, what those stories are. But I think, you know, there's still great power in the technology that we have, and how we can kind of, kind of capture those experiences, those voices, to preserve that history. Because we look back and we're like, oh, there isn't as much as we'd want to from the past to look at. And actually, the whole reason why we have LGBT History Month is to look at like our history and kind of look at, you know, where we've come and the challenges we've had, and learn those lessons from the past. Because actually, you know, I would say we're seeing history repeating itself at the moment. You know, I talk to a lot of people, you know, I wasn't old enough to experience the homophobia of the 80s in the UK, but, you know, I think a lot of people now, and they're like, well, actually, it's gone backwards. It's gone back to that time of the 80s. And actually, I think if we had more stories and more captured info of like, this is where we're at, and actually let's learn from that, I think that's where technology can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, technology is incredibly good at changing. Well, I mean, historically, technology has changed who has access. So when you can only have in-person community, then that favors people in urban areas, people in city centers. You know, you mentioned, I did as well, we grew up in rural areas, and I think you're sort of much more isolated, and if your community doesn't have any queer representation, you know, digital access may be your only way of accessing queer community. And I think especially with the explosion of social media, that transformation has gone not only from connection to mobilization. So social media has allowed people to connect, mobilize, protest, advocate for change and legislation. So it's been incredibly powerful in that way, not just in terms of queerness, but, you know, we've seen in other countries how powerful it's been in almost like revolution. I think it's very powerful in allowing people to democratize and share their own stories and self-archive. So we're no longer necessarily reliant on, you know, when I built the world's first LGBT VR museum, it's because I wanted to build a physical museum, but I didn't have the resources. So I figured I'd use what I had. I had a VR headset, so I built a virtual museum where I scanned real-life objects and then captured people's voices explaining what that object meant to them. So it was objects from people's lives, and centered regular, everyday queer people in a museum, people who museums don't really focus on. Museums tend to share, you know, white, socially dominant, heteronormative narratives. Unfortunately, the downside, I think, of a lot of it is that technological storytelling, it can be very fragile, and technological archiving can be very fragile, and in particular, platform ownership is not particularly democratized. So with my VR museum, you know, we were looking to publish on Meta, but Meta's not necessarily, I think, the best platform for that. And I think that is something that is sort of an unsolved problem currently. While we can use different platforms to mobilize and archive, we don't own those platforms, and that's a sort of a much bigger conversation. Probably I'm not the person to speak about it, but I do think that's a very hard problem, is platform development and democratizing that.
I feel like it's impossible to not talk about technology, to talk about technology without talking about AI, because it's everywhere. And so I guess it'd be really lovely to explore in terms of with the rise of AI, like it's literally, I feel like it's accelerating every day in a very terrifying rate, actually, in every single area of life that we touch. But like, what steps can communities take to make more informed and educated decisions on and around bias and data collection across all online platforms? I mean, that's a very hard thing to solve in one answer, but in terms of like like a starter for 10 of what that could look like.
I'd say primarily learn about it, that, you know, whatever your kind of feelings are towards AI, I do think it's better to be informed and educated. I think it's really important to learn not only about how it works and its limitations, but also around bias, Because when we say AI, that's a really big umbrella. It means a lot of different things. But largely what people are talking about is large language models, LLMs, so things like ChatGPT. And those, they're not quite predictive text, but they work in a slightly similar way. So they're generative, they generate answers. But that doesn't mean everything they say is true. And I sometimes see people using it as a replacement for Google, and it's really important to understand that it is extremely different to a search engine. It is not forwarding you to human-made answers, it is generating new ones based on correlative data. And because it's trained on the internet's data is very skewed and very biased, and so it will not only replicate, but sometimes amplify those biases. It's also, I think, a kind of dangerous step towards lack of regulation, because if a programmer writes a piece of code, they're accountable. But if an AI develops something, it's much harder to place accountability. And it's also much harder for us to have control over what's happening, us as the kind of people, the populace. It's a layer of abstraction between us and technology. So I think there's dangers there that it's really important to educate ourselves about. So particularly to learn about AI and bias, to make sure it's being used in appropriate areas. If it's being used for things like recruitment, that can have really big impacts. So can human bias, so it's really important to learn about that too. But to educate ourselves, to kind of rally for regulation and legislation on a wider social scale, but also things like in your workplace, to question why it's being used, what the potential risks are. And I think also queer people need to be represented not just in data sets, but also within the development teams making these tools. So that's something I'm very passionate about as a software developer myself.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think from my point of view, I think it's just, yeah, same thing really, the message of being careful, like understanding what the AI or where that data is going. You know, I think we kind of, you know, I think the current trend, like we're all aware of at the moment, everyone's making these little AI-generated images of themselves and sharing them online. Like, you know, I've seen my family, like I've done some, and I'm just like, what are you guys doing? Because, you know, you're inputting information into this, like about your job, what you're doing, who you are, your demographics. You know, it's basically just harvesting this data and information on you, so you can have an image to put on your social media. But what is that? You know, who is getting that data? What's it doing? What are you revealing about yourself? You know, untowardly. You know, are you giving it permissions to your account that, you know, you shouldn't be, you know, private information that is accessing there for you. So I think it's just being aware, being careful and mindful of what it's harvesting and what information it's trying to get and who is then going to get that data. And, you know, you talked about, you know, Meta and, you know, X as well. You know, these are openly transphobic and homophobic CEOs at the top of this organization getting all of your data. So is that data safe? You know, are you outing yourself by doing these things? So I think it's just being really careful, being aware that, you know, that data could also be hacked. You know, you kind of putting that information out there. So it's just being careful and mindful of like what you're sharing and how you're sharing it, and using it appropriately. I guess, you know, it's use of AI and chatbots is very resource heavy. So, you know, if you're asking it questions instead of a search engine, just thinking about the energy and water and stuff that's using and the impact that's having on the environment.
The last thing I want to say on it also is just to be aware that there's always been an algorithm that will feed you certain content on your social media platforms because it drives towards engagement. So things like rage baiting is very common to try and kind of get you, and it will tend to polarize people to sort of certain pieces of information. You'll tend to see much more things that conform with your beliefs than challenge your beliefs. That is much exacerbated with AI, and that can really be used to have some surprisingly influential impacts on you as an individual. If anyone's not aware of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I would look that up and educate yourself on how information can be used to influence things like who you're likely to vote for, and how you're likely to act socio-politically. So I'd say engage in conversations with people who have different opinions to yourself, and try and actively seek out sources of information that might be different to those that you're being fed by social media algorithms. I think it's really important to diversify your sources of information.
So we've explored in terms of different ways, in terms of, you know, I think it's a hard one with AI because I don't think it's possible for us to avoid it. So it's about how do we kind of like navigate it in a way that is safe, but also that helps to kind of create an evolution in terms of the world that we are living in. But within that, I think it, sorry, 2 seconds, I've lost my space. Oh my God, okay. Within that, I think there's still some hope in terms of how we can build safe spaces, safe online spaces and communities. And so I'd really love to hear from the both of you in terms of what you would hope online safe spaces for queer communities could look like in a way that is kind of really hopeful and safe, but also leaves room for kind of like challenge and curiosity.
Okay, well, I'll start because I'm sure you've got a lot to say on it. Yeah, I think for me, it's just, it is important to have trusted, safe spaces. I think that's so important for our community. And like in a world where, we've all acknowledged like the online landscape is a pretty horrible space at the moment. Like it's getting harder to find those. So I think there are, for me, I kind of thought about this. I was like, what are the ways that people can do to make, rebuild these safe spaces and in a digital landscape? And I think it is just making sure, like, if you are in that space, that you are standing up to the hatred and prejudice that's there to make sure that it is a safe space for others as well. It's challenging people, but it's also, if you are hosting one of those spaces, is broadcasting that it is a safe space. So, could there be like, you see often like community guidelines of like what you expect and how you expect people to treat and respect other people and the language to be used within forums or spaces. So I think that's something that's really important to set it out right from the start, the expectations, and but also to moderate it so that if people are breaching that, it's actually kind of called up and or they're kind of removed from it if they constantly keep on breaching it. In physical spaces as well, I think, and we're kind of talking about digital place, but like in Bristol, for example, we've got Safe Spaces Bristol, and that's been a great initiative where organisations and I think even online spaces can sign up and say, I am a safe space, and I think that's really important. I actually noticed in the green room there was a little sticker that said everyone is welcome here, and it's just little things like that that kind of give a message that this is a safe space and that you are, as a queer person, welcomed into this space. And you also know, I guess there has to be some meaning behind it as well. It's done in the right way to make sure that actually, I'm not just putting a sticker up though, I'm actually making sure that my space is an open and welcoming space for you. So that is, standing up to the prejudice and hatred if it exists. So I guess it's just ensuring that those things are upheld. But it is also just turning up and supporting these spaces and these venues, our nightclubs. We've got Paul here from the Green Shilling. It's kind of making sure that we have these spaces that we keep on supporting and upholding, as well as the digital spaces where we could just be like, are we too afraid to kind of raise our voices to challenge prejudice and hatred if it's suddenly just a place where it's all horrible landscape? And also the other thing, I think that bias really, isn't it? We all have our own friends network, and we tend to have people that have the same opinions of us, right? So we're all in a little bit of a bubble where we're not kind of seeing the bad as much. Kind of just being aware of that and making sure that you know that it does still exist out there and you kind of help to challenge it. Yeah, I think probably I'd go on it, and you can go a lot deeper.
I'm much less of an expert on physical location or community building and spaces. It's not a thing that I really have much experience of, but in terms of the kind of building digital communities, I guess my ideal scenario would be something that's more community and grassroots and user owned. I did use Twitter back in the day when it was called Twitter heavily, and it was sort of something of a town square to connect with other people. My LGBT VR museum, part of its success was it gained a following on Twitter very quickly. I actually connected through a lot of people who contributed stories through it, and then actually my co-developer, who is a queer man in Denmark, I actually met him through Twitter, and we built the museum together. So that was really powerful, but now I don't use it at all. It's really changed dramatically since, Musk took it over. And I don't feel like anything quite has replaced it. I think a lot of communities went to different places. Technical people went to Mastodon, a few people went to Blue Sky, some people went to Instagram, but that obviously has a lot of its own problems. So I'd love to see a more kind of equitable platform emerge. I'm somewhat hopeful that the advent of AI will lead to more diverse people entering technology as an industry, because it can be a really powerful teacher. There's a term, I don't know if anyone's heard, vibe coding, which is like creating software without being a coder. And I think there are pros and cons to that. There are certain dangers there. But I think the fact that it can democratize development of certain things, like storytelling, it can be incredibly powerful. My ideal would really be a digital space where we're not in these bubbles, where we're encouraged to have dialogue with people whose views challenge our own. Things aren't necessarily polarized or for the purpose of engagement and rage baiting, but actually for productive and challenging conversation. And one of my hopes is that as the internet becomes a bit more hard to navigate, I see now a lot of people moving into analog spaces and physical third spaces and conversation and face-to-face dialogue. And personally, I feel that when you're engaging face-to-face, it's easier to be receptive than online. I find there's a lot of vitriol online. I've been the target of a lot of online kind of aggression and harassment, especially with talks and things like that. But in person, I've really never had that. I've had much more receptive audiences in person. And I think there's this anonymity that people can hide behind when it's an online space. So maybe with the decline of online spaces, we'll see more physical spaces, more dialogue. And I think particularly having more intersectional representation is really important, because people who are marginalized in multiple different ways, so whether it's your ethnicity, your gender, your queerness, your age, I think you will face different challenges. And it's very difficult to build spaces that are intersectional. And I think just having more diverse people in a space and being receptive yourself, talking to people and understanding that the prejudice they face might look very different to the prejudice you face as someone from a different demographic, or maybe the same demographic, but just a different life experience. That can be very eye-opening.
That beautifully kind of, thank you both, that beautifully kind of like takes us to our next question. And you mentioned briefly in terms of the work that you did with Age UK. And so I think it's really important for us to, when we're talking about queer stories, to kind of look at the full kind of breadth of demographic of people within that space. And so it'd be really lovely to hear from both of you in terms of how you feel kind of services or spaces can become more inclusive of older LGBT plus adults specifically.
Do you want me to go first? I have less to say
Yeah,
about
you go
this.
first, go on.
Okay, I'm much less of an expert on this. With my own experience, I was never connected with queer elders. I grew up in this very homophobic community. I was told actually repeatedly that there was no such thing as queer adults, that they didn't exist. And watching Pride on TV was actually what made me realize, hey, look at all these people. Like, they must be, they're all waving rainbow flags. Like, maybe some people think I'm okay and I'm not, a terrible person. So I think, when you run a Pride event, actually, showing that to people who might never attend is still so powerful. It definitely was for me. But because of that, I didn't know any queer elders for a very long time. And really, it was only when I was building my museum project that I connected with any. And it was extremely eye-opening for me, because I didn't really have any perception of what it was like to be queer 40 years ago, or 50 or 60 years ago. And building this museum, we have stories from people who were from the age of 20 to, I think, late 60s is our eldest person, I think, maybe 70s, I didn't ask. Definitely a queer elder, I would say. That was very, very eye-opening. And, I, as a youngish person, I would say I haven't experienced a huge amount of ageism personally. I'm sure I will as I age. So it was really important for me to understand how ageism and homophobia and queerphobia intersect, because I think that is a really unique experience. And I think that depends also on where you are, which country you live in. As you said, Section 28 was extremely impactful on people growing up in those times. Obviously, queer marriage was not legal for a very, very long time and still isn't in many, many countries. So I think training on those things and connecting with queer elders and listening and understanding their stories is really, for me, has been a really important first step.
Well, yeah, I think for me, it's exactly that, really. It's kind of listen to what's needed from the community or what's missing. Just, I guess, think about what older LGBT plus people need, really. Like, it was really interesting just to, like, you know, is it about maybe not a service or provision once you're there, but it's actually how do you get to that service and provision. So it's just kind of understanding a need, and it's we're kind of lucky, I guess, is fortunate, I guess, to have like an elder LGBT group that exists that I can go to and talk to and hear stories and messages. That doesn't always exist, you know, so it's quite hard to kind of capture that information. But yeah, just any opportunity to kind of listen to what people need, and just engage, gather and tell those stories, you know, exactly that. Like, you know, I think there's been so much that we, as I say, we can learn from history and experiences, but, you know, it's gathering those stories and capturing them. And I guess just look for opportunities to kind of share and gather, you know, to bring and connect people together across generations. But yeah, I think in physical spaces, I think it's like accessibility, it's comfort, it's, you know, all those kind of things that can be barriers. And that's where technology can be great to kind of to bring, you know, that access to information to wider people, and ensuring that it's made kind of like technology that's really kind of easily accessible to everyone.
I think it also touches on sort of representation as well, because I'd say like older people are not well represented in general. Like in media, you know, a lot of TV focuses on sort of younger people, and people of a certain age group are sort of more erased or invisible. I think showing queer elders at all in any kind of representative way is very powerful for younger queer people, because for me as a very young queer person, it just showed me that actually people like this do exist. It isn't just a phase. Yeah. You're not necessarily going to grow out of it. And they've survived and they've made it. So you can also become old and still be queer. And that was a really important learning. Like, I think sometimes as a queer young person, you don't see yourself getting old.
No.
And
yeah, you think you know, life ends at 30, and yeah. But no, I think that it's exactly, actually, that's a really valid point, because, you know, we kind of, as I said, mentioned earlier, like people are saying like this, it seems like it's a new thing, and so it's all woke and young people and stuff, but actually no, it's not. It's been around for years, and we've got so many amazing older people in our community, and sadly, you know, because of the AIDS epidemic, we don't have more. But, you know, they exist. And actually, one of the older people said to me, he's like, well, we're old now, and we don't contribute to society, so no one wants to see us. And I'm like, that's not the case at all. Yeah, like, no, I'm going to do something to make sure you're visible and seen. Yeah.
I think if queer elders connected with younger queer people more, that would be a very powerful thing. I think passing on those lessons really empowers us all to sort of come together and you know, have a much wider impact than we can alone.
I'd love to do a beautiful tie to our conversation before we go on to questions from the audience, with a kind of a message of hope. I think there's something beautiful, especially when we get to, I was going to say, our stages of careers in life, making us, I don't know how old we are all collectively, but I think when you get to a place where you can be very much more reflective in terms of your journey, and I'd love to hear in terms of what advice would you give to either the younger version of yourself or a young queer a person exploring their careers in tech, science, activism, or public life?
Do you want me to go first? I mean, for me, I think maybe this is kind of specific to my field, but having been in science, which is largely, depending on the science, male-dominated, having been in public speaking, which is male-dominated, and then having been in tech, which is very male-dominated, I've always kind of felt like I didn't belong. I've actually never worked directly with another female programmer, which is really shocking in all my years. And one thing that especially learning to code or programming or technology necessitates is failing over and over again. And I think when you don't see people that look like you around you and you're failing repeatedly, it's really easy to make the mistaken idea that actually maybe I just don't belong because people are telling me I don't belong and I'm failing. And I think instead you have to realize that failure is part of the process. It's not only like going to happen, it's necessary, it is the growth. And learning to program wasn't the hard part, it was learning to fail and keep going. And once I got comfortable with that, a whole world of opportunity opened up to me. So that would be my advice to my younger self, is don't be afraid to fail. Don't take that as a sign that you don't belong. It in fact means you do. And even if you feel you're not progressing your technical learning, you're progressing your resilience, which is going to have extremely wide-reaching impacts. And don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. the idea is not to be perfect, it is just to improve. So every failure is an opportunity to do that. So keep trying.
So lovely. I think from my point of view, I guess it would just be, just don't give up. And, Louise, you remember a very long time ago we did that It Gets Better campaign, right?
I know, I do remember.
Yeah?
That was maybe
But it's
me
just like,
as a student.
yeah, but it is just like, it is one of those things that it does get better. So, I think young life can be really challenging. I think queer people kind of also then experience additional challenges, and it can just kind of really make you close in really on yourself. And I think the best thing that ever happened to me is just to learn to be myself. And actually, once you stop hiding a part of who you are, and just kind of embracing your full self and bringing your full self to, you can give yourself full self to everything. And I think, even at work, you're kind of holding back. You're trying not to get caught out in a lie about what you really did at the weekend, or who you're with, or your partner. You don't want to slip up and saying something wrong. So you're never giving your fullest, because you've always got half your mind trying to make sure that you're not caught or outed. So I think just kind of in being able to embrace yourself and just be who you are, and then to channel that and just kind of, understand that you can make amazing things happen, but you sometimes just need to be the person that makes that happen. And I think it's one of those things that don't rely on someone else to do something. If you want to make it happen and see it happen, do it yourself and build something. And then if you build something, people will come. But also on that same note, just know that you're not alone. And I think another great thing for people to learn is that they can reach out. They can make connections. You can make connections absolutely anywhere. You'll do it here at the networking. You'll see a friendly face in the audience. You'll do it when you go to, learning courses that you do at universities and things like that. So there's always connections you can make, and people that want to help you to make society better and to make change happen. And yeah, just don't be afraid to kind of pull on that.
Thank you both. I think this is such a privileged position for me to be in, where I get to just take in and listen. And so I hope even for the audience it's just been the exact same. And I think this is such a beautiful thing to kind of give hope to not just queer people, but also the allies within the audience and the rest of on our digital spaces, that there is hope in being exactly as you are. And I feel like the both of you are very much a testament of that. So just thank you for sharing your experience and also being so open and vulnerable, and also just being so honest at the same time. I am going to now pass to Steve. Oh, I'm so sorry. Steve looked at me like, sorry, what? So sorry. Okay, I'm going to pass to the audience, one better, and then I'll pass to Steve. So we're going to take a few questions from the conversations that we've just had. Your hand shot up real quick, so we're going to go with you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I've got a question for Daryn. I'd really like to know why keeping Pride is so important, keeping Pride free is so important to you, and how have you done it, considering so many other Prides charge?
Well, I think thank you for the question. I think for me, it's just remembering how important Pride was for me as a young person to be able to attend. And I think, being, I wouldn't have financially been able to go and pay to be there, to have a ticket to go and enter. And you look at some of the prices for the Pride events, no shade at all, but some of the prices are really exclusionary. We're living in it's still a cost of living crisis. Young people perhaps wouldn't be able to ask for the money from their parents. They might ask where it's going. They don't want something on their bank account if their parents are accessing shared accounts for young people. So I think it's being mindful that not everyone has the same financial accessibility, and that the importance and that Pride is such a vital event for society and challenging hearts and minds, but also for being there to represent people and see themselves reflected is. I would never want there to be a barrier in the way to stop people from attending. So yeah, you know, we do have a Pride event still that offers donation entry. And that's something, even in this really challenging landscape, that's been really important for me. It is getting harder and harder to put events on. Like, costs are increasing massively. And I guess the only way that we can carry on to do that is through the support of the community, so donations. It's people that can afford to get a ticket, making sure that they buy a ticket. You know, we've just announced, like, this year we've introduced a new thing. It's like the actual real cost ticket, and that real cost ticket is £52. That's what we actually need everyone to be able to do if we didn't have, you know, kind of other options in place. So it's about donating, it's about getting tickets, and if you can afford to do so. And also the other way we do it is through our business sponsorship. So, you know, big up to UE Bristol for being one of our sponsors for the last 17 years since we've been going. But it is, you know, that is through that corporate sponsorship, through the fundraising that we do, we're able to subsidize costs and keep donation entry.
Oh, okay. I'm still thinking of how I want to phrase this question, but we're all kind of working people. We participate in society which has structures, and yet we try and do activism in the ways that we can. How would both of you change, or what would you request of the institutions that you know, that you've spoken about, to encourage, or how would you encourage activism? How would you want people to participate more or differently?
Blimey. For me, I often see communities and individuals acting in extremely pro-social, altruistic, and self-sacrificial ways. And then I see sometimes, well, fairly often, large corporations, you know, acting in ways that are damaging to communities or damaging to the environment. And I think fundamentally, I mean, this is a very utopian answer because I don't necessarily think I can achieve this, certainly individually, but I think part of that is that corporations are geared towards financial growth, and that is their success metric. If I could change anything, it would be to change that success metric, such that corporations are accountable to community well-being, positive environmental impact, their employee well-being, as you know, as quantifiable as you can make those things. Obviously, there's lots of questions around how you measure that fairly and equitably, and who's being measured, and you know. But I think if we even had the consideration that corporations should be accountable for those things, that it shouldn't be only financial growth that is rewarded. Shareholders should not only be holding companies accountable for infinite growth at the expense of the planet and everyone on it, because that doesn't make any sense in the long term, because there are no jobs on a dead planet. I think companies should be accountable for other metrics. That would be my one change.
And I guess for me, it's just about, you know, creating spaces so that people can be activists and get involved in things. So, you know, whether that be kind of LGBT plus staff networks or spaces where you can kind of input and gather and feedback and challenge. I think that's really important. But yeah, just in wider society, you know, there are places you can get involved in things, and or as I said, like, if it's not there, build it and create it and get other people involved in it as well. But I think it's just about, you know, that kind of openness to allow that activism and challenge to happen. I think that's what's really important.
Can I pick up on activism and impact? Because Antonia talked about watching Pride on the television. And one of the things with activism is it's fine, you can get 50,000 people marching on the streets and no coverage, and yet something that fits with the journalist's agenda, with 20 people waving a few flags, gets on the coverage. So do you keep going with your message, or do you shape it to get through the media? What's your approach on that, or feelings on that?
That is a really interesting question. So Yeah, I mean, prime example is the genocide that's happening and the coverage of that. You know, it's media can be very biased in the way it presents things. Also presenting things as a kind of equal debate. So having someone who's trans and wants to get on with their life and someone who thinks all trans people should be erased, that's not, you know, that's not an equal debate. That's not a thing that human rights aren't a debate. So I think kind of those kind of vitriolic and hateful narratives being presented as, you know, perfectly valid counterpoints is very problematic in mass media. I think things like social media have had a really big impact on that. So of course people being able to make each other aware in a more grassroots way of things that are happening. So a lot of our awareness around things happening in other countries can come from people either in those countries or people forwarding and sharing messages in a more grassroots way. But it's really interesting what you say about shaping your message, because I've seen a few people, for example, some groups in the US at the moment, being very careful with how they dress and present themselves on protests. So people leveraging certain heteronormative expectations, for example. There are expectations around white women and fragility, and those can be leveraged in powerful ways to show that actually, you know, maybe if you are a white woman, you're dressing in pink and you have a blonde wig on and you look very heteronormative, and that's very disruptive to the mass media's idea of who protesters are and what they want. There's a group of people who wear inflatable costumes, and I think that's a really interesting take on, you know, you don't see those people as threats, you know, rather than wearing masks and balaclavas and beanie hats. It's very disruptive to the media's way of framing protesters. So I think there are very intelligent ways to approach that, and I think people are becoming wise to that. So yeah, it's an interesting and very, very intelligent approach, I think.
I think from my point of view, you're right. You know, the message can sometimes be actually a bad news story is all they're interested in. So actually, if positive stuff is very rare to get some really good meaty coverage on, they're always looking for an angle to the story. And I think it's just, you know, kind of one, being savvy to that. I mean, definitely never, like, personally, like, not changing the message of what we're doing or why, just to please the media. But I think it's just kind of understanding kind of what it is that they're looking for, being aware of that yourself, being self-aware to challenge what they're trying to present, or just being steadfast in your commentary and your engagement. So like if I go on the media and they're trying to push a narrative, you know, bring it back. I control this story actually, and this is what's happening within our community. So it's just kind of, but you know, that's a difficult thing to do when you're, you know, yeah, kind of, if you're a community activist, for example, you don't have media training, you know, necessarily. So it's quite hard to put yourself into that position. And, you know, for me, that's come from years of being put in that position. I've had to learn it. But I guess the other thing is exactly that, you know, using different tools. You know, if you've got a group of media that are, you know, very negative and never run the right stories, positive stories about your community, or only want to kind of show a negative side of things, use alternative ways. And that's where technology and social media actually can be our allies and support that. Yeah, and I think it's also just pushing back a bit. You know, I get asked to talk on behalf of our community a lot, and actually sometimes it's just taking the opportunity to say, actually, you know, for example, if you want to talk to a trans person about trans issues, we've got a great trans pride here in Bristol. Actually, this would be the best person to speak to. So also making sure that I'm not always the person holding that space. But actually, you know, for me, pride and what we do is actually uplifting the community in different ways. And sometimes, if people don't feel comfortable, I will be that person to speak for them. But actually, most of the time, I'm able to direct people to the right people to speak to.
Hi, thank you. That's been so uplifting and inspiring. I want to focus on a slightly negative side, but I hope you'll have some positive view to say on it. So obviously, you both spoke about kind of your upbringing, how things have been very hard. And obviously, things are a lot easier now, and Bristol really is a bubble and incredible and very inclusive, but there are still pockets in communities and workspaces and families where things can be quite difficult, and it still can feel quite alone and quite hard. And I just wondered, like, if you've got any advice for people that are kind of navigating those spaces on how to preserve your own kind of emotional energy when it all feels a little bit relentless and it feels a bit alone.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll say is that self-care is, you know, a form of activism. So I think it's very especially if you're the only person that you know of a certain demographic, you sort of become an ambassador for that demographic, and you feel compelled to challenge every, queerphobic or whatever, your demographic is, comment, and to educate those around you. And as you said, like, to be almost media trained, to have the right stories and facts and figures, because we really privilege certain ways of speaking and engaging. Even if, you're someone that knows something very deeply, if you don't have this sort of oratory and rhetoric about it, you're almost compelled to be trained in that. And I think we sometimes as activists can feel guilty for taking time to rest, and I don't think we should. It is absolutely necessary. And I think news engagement is part of that as well. So, the news does tend to be very negative. However, in terms of many things, there are so many positives. Generally, if you compare 50 years to 50 years to 50 years, generally things move forward in terms of health, in terms of human rights. Obviously, there are times when things move backwards, and it feels like one of those times now. But I think keeping a kind of long view of things and feeling empowered to switch off sometimes from the news. It is important to engage enough to make a difference, but not over-engage to the point where you're paralyzed by anxiety. So for me personally, I tend to educate myself within my sphere of influence. So I'm in technology, and I educate myself around platforming and technology and how I can make that space more equitable. But I have less influence in some other areas, and therefore I sort of don't read as much about those areas. I take time to rest and refill my cup, because I engage with the news with the view of what will make me the most powerful and useful and impactful activist. So do feel free to take time to rest. Please do take time to rest, and that's my contribution.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. But also, thinking maybe about what you can do, and I think it's just, finding those connections that can kind of help you find those moments of joy, and as I say, a bit of hope. So it's kind of overcoming those negative experiences and trying to turn it around into positive. So, it may be, as I say, kind of about a staff network, finding, opportunities there to connect with other people in the workplace. So suddenly you're not alone. You've got someone else actually you can have a little vent to. But it's also, is it challenging the workplace as well? Like, have they got the right policies in place to make sure that this isn't happening? Have you got the right channels to be able to report, if you're hearing homophobic or any phobic language? Like, have you got a channel to kind of report that and it's going to be dealt with properly? So, is that challenging the workplace policies and spaces that you have? But also, I think just getting out and topping up your queer joy resilience, and that can be really powerful. That can be just going out and going to events and being amongst other people. And again, you could make connections there that, build friendships. They might know someone who have similar work or background than you. So it is about kind of building those connections. And for me, that's one of the most powerful things about Pride, is like you kind of go in there and you see thousands of people together just in collective buzz of joy there, and it can top up the emotional batteries and keep you going. But yeah, I think it's just finding moments of joy, taking moments out if you need to.
I also want to ask another question, because that's a really lovely place to finish on. I was actually going to say that as a animal behaviourist, your speech on queer nature is one of my favourite talks I've ever attended. And I work on Pride with Daryn. With students and even professors and lecturers I'm talking to across like humanities and the sciences, I'm hearing how much AI is infiltrating at every level of that. And in my feeling on it, AI tends to regurgitate and reflect the biases that are already present, when it's not just students, it's professors and lecturers, like I say, that I'm hearing this, when they are relying on this tool that is untested, unregulated, and has these biases. Do you think that is a danger to how we progress as scientists and technologists?
Yes, 100%. it's interesting because we're in this period where we're seeing this explosion of it. You know, AI, again, huge umbrella, means lots of different things, but it has existed for a really long time in one form or another. Things like different kinds of behavioral algorithms have existed a long time, but large language models in particular, we've seen explode in popularity in the past, 3 or 4 years, to the point of ubiquity. A lot of people are using them in ways that are irresponsible, I would say. Sharing too much information, using them in places where the bias is going to have really big, wide-reaching impacts, and using it without discretion. I think as people become more educated on its limitations, hopefully we'll see that damp down a bit. I think the past 2-3 years there's been this enormous explosion where we've seen the capability of AI. But what AI is really good at is making things that look plausible but aren't necessarily true. And they don't necessarily always hold up to long-term scrutiny. So currently we're in the short term. But I think when we start seeing the long-term impacts, people will start being more careful. For example, in technology, AI can generate code, but if you're using that indiscriminately, that can result in, for example, security vulnerabilities or bug problems later on down the line. As we see these impacts in finance, in technology, I think it will reflect on AI on the whole, and hopefully people will start being more careful, both through education, through kind of anecdotal evidence and things happening. But yes, there is a huge, I could do a whole talk on this, I'll resist, but yes, there are lots of impacts because of the way AI replicates and actually amplifies biases in its data.
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, thank you. Am I on? Off, on. Thank you very, very much. Please join me in saying a very big thank you to our fantastic guests this evening. And then I'll say a few closing words, but please join me. Louise, Antonia, Daryn, you have been unbelievable. Thank you very, very much. So I was going to say at the beginning, I scribbled down, so UWE has talent, but I've changed it to Bristol has talent. So the two universities working together to create fantastic alumni. Thank you very much for sharing your stories. The power of your stories, of course, comes from your rawness, your courage, and your ability to tell your story. And that, I think, has the one thing that everybody in this audience has been touched by: your honesty and openness, but also your ability to tell your story with power. I've learned a huge amount this evening, so thank you for that. And I suspect everybody here and everybody online will take parts of your stories and build it as part of their knowledge base. And that is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. You've clearly changed people's views and minds. You've challenged. You've articulated, first of all, how complex the world is and is becoming increasingly complex on a daily basis. It's not a kind world. It's a really challenging place at the moment. And for young people in particular, navigating this is really tough. It's hard enough for people who have become established. But for young people, it's really down to us to support and help them through what can always be a difficult period of their lives, but even more so if they're queer. It's our responsibility to support, whether as allies or part of the queer community. And I think you've helped us understand this particularly well. I've loved the way you've blended science, pure, hard, tough science, and psychology and sociology. The human being is complex. The animal kingdom is complex. And you've brought that together and you've brought it to life for everybody here. And again, a very powerful way of blending that. You've taken us on your journeys, all of you, individually, and you've shared your lives, and you've given a window into what makes you tick. And you've done it in a very open, transparent way. And I thank you for that. This is one of the most powerful addresses I've heard, I think. It is one of those that's going to stick in my memory. So thank you for that. We've touched on AI, the beauty, the dangers of artificial intelligence. And I think that we will carry on that story. It's a tool, but in the wrong hands, it can be catastrophic. Our job is to challenge it. Our job is to teach people how to use it correctly and not to believe it. Which takes me into your world of social media. Young people in particular are addicted to social media, that perfect world, and they believe it. And we see it every day in our universities, in our schools, and in our colleges. Again, our job is to create the environments within which they can challenge. We've talked about safe spaces, physical and digital. Again, really important that we work together to create those safe spaces. And finally, and I'll end on this because I think it's so lovely, everybody can make amazing things happen. Everybody has the ability to do that. And to do it with others. You're not alone. There are communities. We can work together. But finally, what I took, I think, most powerfully away was be human, be yourself, be kind and compassionate, live your lives, and look after yourselves. And most of all, remember to top up your queer joy resilience. And that should be our message, not just to our queer community, but to everybody. Everybody matters. Everybody's voice and everybody's story matters. Thank you for sharing yours. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a final round of applause for our fantastic speakers. And brilliant. I suspect we're going to see Louise even more doing these sorts of interviews. This is the second or third time I've seen you do this, so congratulations, well done. Not easy, thank you. Please join us for some light refreshments and some mingling, and also please take a chance to have a look at some of the stands that are there. Test your knowledge. There's chocolates if you get it right, but the good news is there's chocolates if you get it wrong. So everybody's a winner, but have a look at our colleagues who have been at the back, patiently waiting for you to engage with them. Please join us. Thank you very much.